Spider-Man 2 for PS5 feels like two completely different games slammed together by a particle accelerator. It's definitely an awesome and explosive experience, but questions remain of whether the result is stable. For the most part, I really enjoyed this game, so in some ways this is good news, two games for the price of one. However, much like Peter himself, the game often seems at odds with itself, continuously trying to merge two different visions or experiences into one package that never quite reaches full symbiosis. In this video, we'll discuss why that is, so beware of minor spoilers ahead, and please click subscribe to support the channel. Spider-Man 2 is essentially split between a series of cinematic but linear, action-heavy story missions and a more relaxed, exploratory open world bursting at the seams with collectibles and upgrades. Interestingly, these two halves of the game are almost completely different from one another in terms of gameplay, pacing, story, and even visuals in some ways. I would argue that the main storyline of this game could actually exist on its own without the open world at all. In fact, as long as you're fairly skilled at the combat in this game, you can actually play through the entire game just like that. Let's look at each of these halves and why they feel so different from one another. Let's start with those story missions first. Spider-Man 2 features a fairly lengthy campaign of story missions that are big on cinematic storytelling and even bigger on action sequences. A few scenarios in this game might even make Nathan Drake shy away. Some of these missions are very long, sometimes too long in my opinion, with lengthy sequences that go on and on to the point of exhaustion at times. During these missions, you're almost always doing one of four things: watching a cutscene, fighting seemingly endless waves of increasingly armored bad guys, slowly wandering or crawling around a nicely rendered environment to inspect details to trigger the next cutscene or battle, or fighting some sort of boss or mini-boss. Occasionally, there's a delightfully pointless minigame to break up the pacing, which I always enjoyed, but for the most part, almost every story mission in the game follows this general recipe. Most of these story missions take place in what I would call very separate or isolated environments from the main open world. Sometimes you're in a giant industrial facility, other times it's a futuristic science lab where particle accelerators are just another piece of office equipment, and other times some sort of huge yet undetected private military compound. In the context of the main story, the open world seems to only exist to provide some sort of travel buffer between destination points. As you arrive, a cutscene triggers, and you usually end up inside of some kind of detailed facility or outdoor area with cinematic camera angles and invisible walls that don't let you leave without ending the mission. These environments rarely include freeform swinging and traversal, which in my opinion is the best aspect of the gameplay. Instead, you're usually just walking around, climbing walls slowly, or web-zipping through linear paths. I'm not necessarily saying all these things are bad, but they feel completely different and strangely limiting compared to the open world. So let's talk about that open world. A huge, visually stunning map of New York City is open for you to explore from every angle. You swing between buildings, launch across neighborhoods, glide over rivers, slingshot across intersections. It all looks and feels bigger and better than ever thanks to the power of the PS5. Contrary to some complaints out there, I think this game looks stunning, and New York is noticeably busier and more alive this time around than it ever was on the PS4. The 40 frames per second mode in particular is awesome if your TV supports those higher refresh rates. However, exploring the open world is almost the exact opposite experience of the main story. For the most part, you can swing anywhere in the open outdoors, scaling tall buildings and running all over the place. The camera is pulled back for a wider view of large environments rather than narrowing close up on more restricted areas. The open world missions also sharply contrast the main story missions. In the same way that the story missions are often overdone or over the top, the open world activities generally feel underdeveloped or overly simplistic. Your goal is to clear out all of the troublesome activities in each of the dozen or so zones around the city. Unfortunately, every single zone basically consists of the exact same set of activities and even provides a percentage tracked list to check them all off. Fight a group of bad guys on a rooftop, take down the bad guy's main base, take a picture of a landmark, locate spider bots, find hidden caches of weapons or tech parts, clear out symbiote hives. Once the zone is clear, repeat this process in the next zone over and over. There are also side quests that do add a bit more context to the areas with micro stories and random characters. Some of these are mildly interesting, but many are very bland.
I'm looking for my Grandpa Earl.
I would have gladly traded some of the overtop story mission production values for richer open world activities. Open world tasks generally feel very trivial and rarely take more than 5 to 10 minutes to complete, and often much less, while story missions can be very long and involved. As a side note, I also found the open world part of this game to be a bit disappointing because almost every activity you partake in has some direct equivalent to previous Spider-Man games, so by the third entry, this formula is starting to feel a bit worn, even if it is generally still fun to zip around the city. Now, the main problem I have with this design is that it just creates such a strong separation between the open world activities and the main story. Pretty much the only connection between them is that the open world is used to collect various tokens and currencies to upgrade your gear and make the story missions easier. Other than that, the open world mostly just connects point A to point B. Occasionally, the story missions will have some sort of impact on the open world, but this is also kind of hit or miss. For example, in the opening sequence of the game, Sandman attacks and covers what looks like half of the city in endless sand. However, immediately after that fight, still very early in the game, the city is already pretty much cleaned up and it's like things never happened, aside from a few remaining Sandman remnants you have to defeat. There's very little connection between the open world and the story, though this does improve a little bit with some events at the end of the game, and I wish we had seen a lot more of that. Occasionally the story will overlap with the open world via a chase sequence, but this feels like a glorified version of using the open world to get from point A to point B. You're still swinging between two isolated areas, there just happens to also be a monster running away in front of you. Major moments in the story quests usually just result in opening up more collectathon activities in the open world afterwards, such as clearing out more bases of X enemy type or collecting more data about Z story element. It seems like the developers just weren't entirely sure how to leverage the open world for compelling story scenarios. Now, to be fair, I don't think that this is a Spider-Man specific problem. Many open world games have this sort of disconnect where the main story just feels kind of separate or removed from the open world and even has a different style of gameplay. I think the Horizon series on PlayStation, for example, also has this problem. However, I think with Spider-Man, it's more noticeable because the world traversal in the open world is so dynamic and free, whereas the story missions can feel somewhat slow, restricted, and closed in by comparison. Horizon, on the other hand, just kind of always feels slow and clunky no matter what you're doing, so it's not as obvious. I think this is one of the reasons I enjoyed Tears of the Kingdom so much earlier this year. With the exception of the intentionally separated puzzle shrines, that game feels truly open world. There's no weird disconnect between story missions and the actual open world. It just feels like everything you do actually takes place in the same environment locations you can freely explore on your own. Even all of the temples in the game, you can just freely wander in and out of them at any given time. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure how to fix this in games like Spider-Man. Maybe more of the story missions could take place directly on the streets of New York instead of these separate crafted environments. Maybe more story missions could include bigger environments and free-swinging web mechanics of the open world. Maybe the open world could just focus on quality over quantity, more meaningful quests and activities beyond just glorified checklists of trivial tasks. What are your thoughts on this? Did you enjoy the two halves of this game? Did you feel that one outshined the other? Please hit subscribe and that like button, and leave a comment to share your thoughts.